Hi, today is the 17th of June. Welcome back. I'm going to start my lecture on Chapter 6, okay? And Chapter 6, I think, is going to have to be split out over this week and also into next week, so we'll wrap it up then along with Chapter 7. Okay, we are going to talk about the valuation of stock. Now, in the last chapter, we talked about how to value bonds, and we determined that bonds were fairly easy to value because their cash flows are finite. With a couple of exceptions, rare exceptions, we know when a bond's going to mature, and that means we know exactly how long the interest payments will last, and we know how long it's going to take us for our principal to then be repaid at maturity. Okay, now that's not the case with stock. Stock is assumed to go on to infinity. Does that create a problem? More on that in a moment. No, it does not. Okay, so we're going to figure out why stock prices are where they ought to be. Okay, Chapter 5 was about lending. Chapter 6 is about equity. Okay, now remember, businesses raise money and they need money for their continual growth and expansion. And ideally, they would generate enough money to do that by their own operations. That's the best of all worlds, okay? But if that doesn't work, out of the three places that a company typically raises money from, there are two other alternatives, okay? They can do as we did in Chapter 5 and essentially borrow it. I'm going to issue bonds and take your money, and now you become a debt holder. You're a creditor of my corporation, but you haven't got any rights of an owner. Okay, so if I don't want to do that, if my investment banker doesn't recommend I do that for whatever reason, or if I simply don't want to do that, then what I can do instead is to issue stock, okay? Both with issuing bonds and issuing stock, I'm giving something up, okay? I'm tying myself into a contractual relationship. In Chapter 5, I've got to pay you interest and then give you your money back. In Chapter 6, I have to give up a piece of ownership, okay? So if I feel like that's a better alternative than borrowing money from you, or if my investment banker recommends it as a way to raise funds, then Chapter 6 is the way to go. So in this case, I will issue ownership to you rather than borrowing it from you, okay? Again, valuing bonds in Chapter 5 was easy, as we saw, because it's got a fixed amount of time until the bond matures and you get your money back, and we also know right up front what the formula for calculating the interest cash flows will be as well. Okay, so the math was pretty easy. The math isn't hard in Chapter 6. It could be, but this is a basic course, okay? Depending on the type of stock that you're trying to value, it can become a little complicated, but here in Chapter 6, our goal is to just get started. So I've chosen 3 of the most common profiles for stock, okay? Now, stock has perpetual existence, even though we know that sometimes companies merge, they're absorbed, they go bankrupt, they liquidate, whatever. Excuse me. In practical terms, when stock is created, it's assumed to last forever, okay? So it doesn't follow the rules about bonds that have a finite amount of time, all right? Bonds are very easy to measure in time. So back when I wrote this, August of 2013, Verizon, VZ, was trading at $50.25. What made it worth that amount of money? Well, in general, it's the rule of the marketplace that did. Willing buyers and willing sellers got together and said a proper price for that stock in the market, the bid and ask prices, the buying and selling of shares, as we've seen already, determined that $50.25 is what we all agree it should be worth. Having said that, believe it or not, there is a mathematical formula to determine that $50.25 as well, okay? The perception of a couple of variables from minute to minute in a moving market inside of that mathematical formula are what are allowing us to determine that price of $50.25. So yes, it is based on our perception and our market, but it is also mathematically determinable also, okay? So we determine that price. More importantly, our beliefs in the market determine that price. It is still based on expected cash flows. I told you in Chapter 5, the general rule is that the value of any financial instrument today is based on the present value of its expected future cash flows. That's fine with bonds. Well, you know, it works that way with stock as well. It takes a little more thought, that's all. And I'm going to show you how it's done. Okay, these pictures on the far left and on bottom left, I should say, and on the bottom right. Okay, we all know that stock is issued for corporations. Those gentlemen on the lower left founded a company called Kongogumi. They were acquired by a company called Takamatsu a while back, but they still have autonomy. They still have a separate identity, and that is the oldest continuing corporation ever in the world, in history. Okay? On the right, you may have actually seen or maybe even been to this place. That's in Newport, Rhode Island. It's called the White Horse Tavern, and it is the oldest continuing corporation in the United States. Okay? It was founded in 1670, roughly, which is 50 years after Plymouth Rock and 20 years before the Salem witch trials. It's still an open and existing business now, so go on in there and have a beer and a club sandwich for me sometimes. Okay? My point is that this is not a history trivia class, okay? My point is that corporations are expected, on paper, in theory, to last forever. Here are some companies that are very common names that we all know, except for the last two, which I've just indicated to you. Okay, Remington, I don't mean the shaver company that's now defunct, I mean the gun company, okay, Remington Firearms, okay? They've been around forever. Brooks Brothers, the Sioux people, DuPont, okay? Irénée DuPont, when he first emigrated from France and he came here to the United States, was fleeing the French Revolution, okay? And the DuPont family fortunes, all of which are pretty much centered in the Wilmington, Delaware area. I've visited them. They're very remarkable. Was all based on Irénée DuPont's invention of a revolutionary, no pun intended, gunpowder formula. Okay, so that was the start of the DuPont legacy that continues to this day. Colgate, of course, hygiene products. Seth Thomas, the clockmakers. These are all extremely old American corporations, okay? White Horse I mentioned, Kongogumi I mentioned. Okay, so again, corporations are intended to last forever. All right, types of stock. We narrowed it down in chapter 3, I think it was, to two general types, two broad types, common and preferred. Chapter 4, that's what it was. Preferred is considered safer than common, at least in the early stages of a company's life, because it's going to give the preferred shareholders first crack at any dividends. Okay? All right. We also saw that over time, common stock does end up being the better type because there is no ceiling at all on the dividends that you will be receiving. Okay? All of this is highlighted for you on pages 120, 121 as a refresher. Please, if you own stock, always vote the stock. Okay? My two children, very, very smart, but both of them have said to me at different occasions, I feel like it's useless to vote in Massachusetts because the Democratic Party is always going to win in this state, okay? So their vote to them is unimportant. Don't feel that way, please. I don't care if you own one share of a company's stock. They will give you the right to vote your shares every single year or when special elections come up. Make sure you vote it. If you can't be there to vote it personally, which you have a right to do, by the way, they'll send you a proxy form which allows you by mail, by internet, or by telephone to tell the company how you wish to vote your shares. That's known as a proxy. You're going to assign your desires, your vote, over to one of the members of the board of directors. You can go to the meeting if you want. If the shareholders meeting is held in Las Vegas, you may want to go. If it's held in Moose Jaw Falls, Minnesota on January 15th in the middle of winter, you might want to give it a second thought. Okay? All right, when you issue stock, it's very easy to issue stock and to make the process happen. You simply file a 4-page application, at least here in Massachusetts, with the Secretary of the Commonwealth, and you can fill one of those out in an hour. And after a couple of weeks, you pay them a $25 fee, at least it was $25 when I started my company. Then basically you've got permission, okay? But you have to also draft bylaws. That's going to be a set of documents that write down how the corporation will be governed, okay? It'll indicate the powers and responsibilities of the president, of the secretary, of the clerk, the treasurer, and such things, okay? Those may also be done by you yourself. I've written bylaws myself, but that's when you might want to get a lawyer involved if there are several shareholders and you want to make sure that you're all friends right up front, so you want a neatly written set of bylaws. Okay? This is also where you might have a preemptive right. Okay, now the laws are very friendly towards shareholders as far as making sure that your rights are not diluted. Okay? If you own 5% of a company, a corporation, and someone tries to do something that will diminish that 5% holding, okay, you have certain rights. One of them is the preemptive right. If you go to bed with 3% of a company, you have the right to wake up in the morning with 3% of the company. Okay? Otherwise, your percentage holding, and therefore your say in the company's matters, is diluted. Okay? And you might not want that. You can design a right of first refusal in case you want to sell your shares, or in case you are a co-shareholder, especially in a smaller corporation, a privately held corporation. And if someone wants to sell their shares, you don't want them selling them on the outside to an unfriendly party. So when you're putting your company together, you may put in qualifications like if any shareholder wants to leave and sell his or her shares, they have to offer them to you first. Okay, so this is when everybody is friends, and this is when you want to be absolutely meticulous about designing the conduct of your corporation. All right? All right, and if you want examples from my own company's charter, that's Accutech, that's my own company, then I will happily provide those to you. Okay, now, if you've seen one of my favorite movies, Wall Street, you would have seen a gentleman named Gordon Gekko, played by Michael Douglas. The original movie is excellent. I've recommended it to you before. He was a takeover artist. He engaged in hostile takeovers, sometimes friendly ones, but if the friendly takeover would not work, he would get very unfriendly and very adversarial. And if a company's stock is in play and publicly traded, there are a few things stopping an acquirer from buying larger and larger blocks of stock and eventually having influence and maybe even taking the company over. Okay? So as long as someone is doing things legally and is cashed up, very little is in that person's way. Okay? It can be between willing parties, and it might not be. Okay? And sometimes the company does not want to be taken over. Okay? When a person buys enough voting stock, they can start having an influence on the board of directors, and they may even be in a position to try to buy the works, the whole thing, on a friendly basis, on a not so friendly basis. Okay? That is, of course, called a hostile takeover. Now, companies don't like to be taken over sometimes. What can they do? Do they have anything that they can do? Yeah. It can be expensive and painful. There are a couple of them I've noted in the book. And this is just, there are many. I mean, people in investment banking and law are very clever. They've come up with a whole bunch, but I'll just give you a couple of them here. The poison pill, first of all. A poison pill strategy can make the acquisition of stock undesirable to a hostile acquirer. For example, if someone ends up owning more than 5%, there's a contract in place that gives additional rights to the existing shareholders and makes the company much more expensive and difficult to take over. It's also called shock repellent. Okay? There's the white knight strategy, where if you're the bad guy trying to buy my company, I might know somebody else who I would much rather be associated with, so I'll see if she will take over my company with me on a friendlier basis. So they ride in like the white knight of legend to save me from, well, I guess you'd be the black knight now, wouldn't you? Okay? The crown jewel defense simply means that a company is going to have some assets that produce much, much more revenue than others. So it might try to take those jewels, those plum assets, those great assets, and have the right to sell them off to a friendly party, thereby making what's left not all that great and not worth buying. Okay? So there are a few other cute ones here. I kind of like Jonestown. You may recall Reverend Jim Jones, who, it's not a funny story actually, but he was a cult leader in, I think it was California, and a lot of people followed him blindly. He ran afoul of the law, and he ended up moving to a compound in Guyana on the north coast of South America. And when the authorities were closing in on him, his followers all lined up, and rather than be arrested or disbanded, they all drank Kool-Aid laced with arsenic and committed mass suicide. Anyone who didn't want to was forced to at gunpoint, which led to I guess, a rather tasteless joke about the fact that I was going to tell you a joke about Jonestown, but the punchline was too long. I'm sorry, I just had to throw that in. But in any case, what is the Jonestown defense? The Jonestown defense simply means that the company would rather see itself destroyed than be taken over. Okay? Kind of like in Jonestown. Now, that may sound far-fetched, but I want you to keep something in mind. I told you about the dispute that we had with one of our former owners, co-owners, and at one point when we told him he was going to have to essentially leave his job with us because he was not performing, a dispute developed. And at one point he said, why don't we all sell out instead of you guys just firing me? Far-fetched? No, his ego was such that he could not abide the thought of our company going on without him being in it. So stranger things have happened. That's the Jonestown defense. The company will essentially disband itself rather than be taken over. The Pac-Man defense, you all know the video game Pac-Man, where you control a little character that's eating up all these little pellets while it's being chased by monsters. But when it hits a certain power type of pellet that it's eating, it can turn and start chasing the monsters. Okay, the Pac-Man defense simply means that if you're trying to acquire me, I might find an associate who's very cashed up and very powerful. I will partner with that person, and in turn, we will try to take you over instead. Okay? So those are some of the common defenses you'll see. There are many, many others on how clever lawyers and investment bankers try to prevent a takeover from happening. Dividends. Okay, that's one of the most far-reaching responsibilities of a board of directors. Dividends are up to the board, as I've told you before. A corporation is under no obligation to pay you a dividend. Okay? It's up to the board. You have no contractual claim. You can put an awful lot of pressure on the board to pay you a dividend. Okay? But still, that's not the same as having the right to it. All right, what do you need? You need three things in order to pay a dividend. The board of directors needs three things. Number one, it has to have accumulated profits. That's what dividends are. It's a distribution of past profits that have built up in the account that we call retained earnings. Secondly, the company has to have cash. A company can have a ton of retained earnings, but be short on cash, and it would be irresponsible of the board of directors to issue a dividend and place the company's liquidity in jeopardy. Okay, so a company does have to have cash with which to pay that dividend. It must have wherewithal. Thirdly, it requires a formal vote of the board of directors. Okay, are dividends good or bad? All right, it's always nice to receive a dividend check. We all love money, don't we, coming in? Look at the epigraph at the front of this chapter, okay? Epigram, I'm sorry, the epigram by Rockefeller. The only thing that gives me pleasure is to see my dividends coming in. How vainglorious is that, okay? So you love to see a dividend check. However, say to yourself, well, hey, I'm an owner of the company, okay? And by receiving that dividend, I have just taken money away from my company that it should be plowing back into its growth and its profitability. So there's a bittersweet aspect to dividends. Please remember that. Okay, and of course, you don't have a contractual right to dividends. The board simply does not have to pay them if it doesn't want to, or most commonly, if it would be fiscally irresponsible for the board to do so. Okay? Now, once the company does issue dividends, especially a popular, publicly traded company, usually dividends are paid quarterly. Okay, so once a company stops doing that, okay, it's very hard to interrupt it or scale it back. People look for the dividends to grow ever so slightly. Okay? So if all of a sudden the board says, oh, we're not paying one this time around, or says, well, I know we've been paying 25 cents a share every single quarter, now we're going to make it 20 cents a share, what's that going to do to the price of the stock? It will have a very drastic effect. It's going to push the value of the stock downward. There is a correlation, and that's part of the math involved here, between dividends, future cash flows that you expect, right? And the price of stock. Okay, that's Rockefeller, his own self, down in the bottom right. All right, now if If you have a small privately held corporation, issuing a dividend is easy, okay? Our partner and we would simply say, hey, it's vacation time, let's take a dividend. I'd sit down with the company's checkbook and write a couple of checks, and that was the dividend, okay? It was very informal. But in a company with several shareholders, or most definitely always in a publicly traded company, it has to be quite formal, and that means defining 3 dates. 3 dates, okay? The first date is the declaration date. I'm going to pick April 1st, okay? The declaration date, that's the date that the board of directors meets and says, we're doing it officially. The dividend has now been declared. It's formal, it's a done deal, okay? That's the date of declaration. Now that is formal, and that means the company's accounting staff now has to make a journal entry. They're going to have to appropriate a piece of retained earnings and record it as being payable to the shareholders. So a journal entry must be made. It's a formal action. It's not going to be paid now. It'll be paid later. Now, when you have an obligation to pay something later, what's it called? We learned in accounting it's called a liability. So we're going to decrease equity, retained earnings. We're going to set it aside. But because we're not paying it right away, we're going to increase, with the credit if you recall, a liability called dividends payable. Okay? Sometimes retained earnings are reduced directly. Sometimes a contra account is used, and that contra account will be closed later on. Okay? But don't worry about that. This is not an accounting class, but if you're looking at this from an accounting point of view, that's how it would work. The second of 3 dates is the date of record. On the declaration date, April 1st, the board's going to say, we are declaring a dividend, and if you want to get the dividend, you must own the stock on this day or before. Okay? That's going to be, let's say May 1st. Okay? So on April 1st, the directors say, if you own the stock on May 1st or buy it no less than 3 days before, then you are entitled to the dividend. If you buy it after that, tough, you don't get the dividend. Will that have an impact on the price? Of course it will. Okay? If I have a chance to buy a stock with the dividend or without the dividend, okay, I'd want it with the dividend. Otherwise, I'm not going to buy it for as much. So once you pass that date of record, you can expect the price of the stock to decrease ever so slightly by the amount of that dividend. Last of the 3 dates is the actual payment date. So on the declaration date, the board says, today, April 1st, we're declaring a dividend of X dollars per share. You must own the stock on the date of record, May 1st, and if you do, then on June 15th, the payment date, we're going to send you a check. Okay, the first and the third dates require an entry. The second one, it does not. It's just a memo. On the payment date, obviously, the liability goes away and cash decreases. Okay? All right. If you buy the stock after the date of record and pay less for it, that's called trading ex-dividend. So when you buy a stock ex-dividend, it means that you're owning the stock, but the most recently declared dividend, you're not going to get it. You didn't own it in time. You didn't own it on the date of record. Okay, when you measure dividends, we usually do it on an annual basis, but they are usually paid by publicly traded companies on a quarterly basis. So if Coca-Cola's stock is $3 a share, okay, then every quarter you'll get 75 cents per share. Okay, that's it for now. Time is up. More to come on Chapter 6 soon. Take care, friends. Enjoy your day.